I'm Rebecca. I work for the Church of Scotland head office and speak to Muriel and Stuart daily, weekly in here. They're saying fantastic things about you and I've wanted to meet you for ages. So
that's great. Thank you.
And I'm Muriel.
Yeah, we're close friends. Good, so my name's Anton Goodman. As you can probably tell from my accent, I wasn't born here. I moved to Israel about 23 years ago from the United Kingdom. And I've been living here since. I work for Rabbis for Human Rights. We're a network of 170 Israeli rabbis. Non-denominational, as we have every denomination or Jewish denomination, from Orthodox, Conservative, Reform, Reconstructionist, Humanist, and even secular rabbis that exist in Israel. Try and work that one out. Secular rabbis, yes, yeah. It's a fairly recent stream, and it's a good addition. And I thought I might start with an opening, with a kind of a deep dive into Jewish theology, which leads us to some of the complexities of statehood in the Holy Land, which is an intoxicating beverage which can either send you to spiritual highs or get you drunk and careless. Because the relationship between the Jewish people and the land of Israel obviously goes back to the first interactions with our forefathers. But from the beginning, it's a very metaphysical relationship. And you might notice this in Jerusalem because you've got so many beautiful churches and beautiful mosques. But where, in fact, are all of the beautiful synagogues? And there's a couple. We had one very important one, a temple, but we haven't had such a building for 2,000 years. And part of the understanding of that is that in Jewish theology, this is the place where heaven and earth meet, especially here in Jerusalem. And it's not about physical ownership, it's more about spiritual commitment. And in fact, when we talk about the physicality of Judaism as well, I can quote the very important American rabbi from the 1960s, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel of blessed memory, who in his work on the Sabbath, which is really an important work in understanding our faith, speaks about not creating castles of spirituality and physicality, but in time and in spirituality. And we see from our earliest texts that the relationship between the Jewish people and the land of Israel is a relationship based on, it's a conditional relationship based upon our actions and spirituality within the land. Clearly says, if you walk in my ways, in b'chokotai telechu, in mitzvotai tishmoru, if you keep my commandments, then the rains will come on time and there will be peace in the land. If you look at the destruction of the Second Temple and the exile of the Jewish people, there's a consensus amongst the rabbis that this happened because of baseless hatred. And so it might have been a geopolitical conflict going on here. There might have been a Jewish revolt leading to Roman suppression. But theologically within Judaism, it's because there was baseless hatred and it was a divine punishment that exiled us from the land. And throughout, the relationship, you have this conditionality of your very presence on the land being in some way, you're either bringing the divine word to earth or you don't have a place here. And when we look at what is the divine word, what is that work that needs to be done? And we see in the Old Testament that the commandment that's most often mentioned in the Old Testament is you must love the stranger as yourself because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. And that commandment is mentioned 36 times in the text, more than any other commandment. And it's interesting because over time there's been arguments about that text, because it says in the Hebrew gerim, ger, meaning a stranger, a foreigner. But there's later rabbis who have said, that means ger tzedek, a just foreigner, someone who has converted to Judaism. But then comes Maimonides and shoots that down, Maimonides being the most important Jewish philosopher from the 11th century. We say from Moses to Moses, there was no one like Moses. That's the Jewish phrase. As in from Moses. His first name is Moses. Moshe lo haya k'Moshe. From Moses to Moses, there wasn't like Moses. So from Moses, from the our leader and the bringer of the Torah, of the Old Testament, to Moses Maimonides, there wasn't anyone like that. And he comes and he says very clearly, and anyway the text is quite clear, because it says, you must love the stranger in your midst, because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Now we did not convert in the land of Egypt, and we were not, but we were clearly not part of the Egyptian people, so it's quite prescriptive of what needs to happen there. And the relationship becomes even more metaphysical, because since the exile for 2,000 years, the place of Israel is central within Judaism. 3 times a day we pray and we face towards Jerusalem, no matter where we are in the world. In fact, there's a key text from the Mishnah, from the Oral Torah, from the 5th century. It says, if you're outside of Israel, you face towards Israel. If you're inside of Israel, you face towards Jerusalem. If you're inside Jerusalem, you face towards Temple Mount. If you're on Temple Mount, you face towards the Holy of Holies within the temple. And then they ask, what happens if you're on a donkey riding and there's a threat of thieves around you? This is a very kind of Mishnaic text. And they said, in which case either you can turn your face, or if you can't even do that, you turn your heart towards Jerusalem. And that turning of your heart towards Jerusalem is the relationship the Jewish people has had for 2,000 years with this land, a metaphysical connection. When we get married, we say the words, if I forget thee, O Jerusalem, and we break a glass under the Jewish wedding chuppah, the ceremonial canopy, because of the destruction of the temple. We have several fast days in the year that we keep till today, about the siege of the first temple, the siege of the second temple, the breaking of the walls, the destruction of the temple. It is something that comes up over and over again. Within our liturgy, in every prayer service, we talk about Jerusalem and about Israel. And yet for 2,000 years, there was not a significant movement of Jewish people to Israel. There were significant rabbis who made it here during that period. One of them famously, Judah Halevi from the 11th century, came here and actually found his death upon arriving in the land, arrives here and finds himself decapitated pretty quickly by someone. But he wrote a defining text called the Kuzari, Sefer Kuzari, the Kuzari book, which is a philosophical text from the 11th century about the king of the Khazars who decides that his people will convert to Judaism, and he's having a philosophical conversation with a rabbi. It's a wonderful text. And it's a series of questions that the Kuzari asks the rabbi. And there's one specific question that's of interest because no answer is given. Of all the others, there are questions, an answer is given. But the question that the king of the Khazars in the 11th century, that I'm still asking till this day, he says, I understand that the Jewish people are a persecuted minority spread out around the world, around our region. What will happen if they return to the land of Israel and become the majority? What will happen when the shoe is on the other foot? And the rabbi can't provide an answer to this question. And it remains the question that we are struggling with today in contemporary Jewish thought, I think, and definitely in contemporary Jewish action. And so we have this relationship that, is so symbolic and so central to our faith. And then at the turn of the 20th century, it starts to become a reality with the Zionist movement. And at the beginning of the Zionist movement, there was, if you would go to the first World Zionist Congress, you would find very few Orthodox Jews in attendance. It was not something that was adopted by Orthodox Jewry. In fact, at the time, it was, it wasn't the mainstream amongst the Jewish population worldwide. I mean, Herzl's book, The Jewish State, in Yiddish definitely undersold Shalom Aleichem's works, for instance, of more kind of shtetl literature. That was of more interest to people at the time, but obviously it grew in stature. But you didn't find Orthodox Jews attending the World Zionist Congresses at the beginning. And the reason for that is because there's an important passage in the Talmud, in the Tractate of Sanhedrin, that talks about the 3 oaths, that the Jewish people are forbidden to return to the land of Israel and to set up a sovereign state unless there's certain signs of messianic redemption. And so if you go to ultra-Orthodox communities, even within the land of Israel today, many of them still hold by these and say you can't climb the wall, ascending the wall, in the sense that you're going against the divine process of redemption. Even more so is seeing secular Jews bringing about, secular nationalist Jews bringing about a state of Israel. How can it be, said the Orthodox? How is it possible that those who have renounced their, legal or halachic commitments to Judaism are those who have the audacity to create a state on the land of Israel? And at that time there was a small contingent of the beginning of national religious Judaism, led by a rabbi called Rav Reines in the early 20th century. And his main focus, with that small section of Orthodox Jews who were part of the Zionist movement, was around saving Jews from the pogroms that were going on at that time. I connect to this deeply. My family escaped the pogroms at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, from Belarus, Ukraine, that kind of area, the Pale of Settlement. They ran away literally. They traveled Europe by foot. I remember my great-grandfather, who I had the privilege to get to know and meet. He only ever spoke Yiddish. And he used to tell us the story of being a child and crossing borders in Europe at night, losing a shoe and having only one shoe, crossing Europe with one shoe. And at that time, it was under the Jewish law of pikuach nefesh, which means saving a life. And the law of saving a life in Judaism is higher than almost every other commandment that you have. And so you can break the Sabbath, you can eat non-kosher, you can do all kinds of things in order to save a life. And that was the reason that when Theodor Herzl suggested Uganda and brought it as a vote to the World Zionist Conference in 1906, that the only people who voted together with Herzl were the religious Zionists. The only people who voted against the land of Israel for the state for the Jewish people were the religious Zionists, because they said this is pikuach nefesh, this is saving a life. That's why we're in this. We need a refuge to run away from the persecution. And it doesn't matter that it's not on the land of Israel, because that's not our primary focus. And so the question that begs to be asked is, how did this change? Because this is not the reality on the ground today. You remember the intoxicating beverage we spoke about at the beginning. And it's very hard not to partake of the intoxicating beverage, especially if you're an Orthodox Jew. If you're an Orthodox Jew, every week, not only do you read the Torah portion, the Old Testament portion in the synagogue, you also read the Haftarah, which comes from the prophets and the writings. I don't know if that's what you call it. Prophets' writings? Nach. And there, they've chosen many that are kind of the more messianic or the redemption process, where you have the prophets Isaiah, Zechariah coming in and saying, Jerusalem is totally abandoned, but once again, old people and young people will be seen in the streets of Jerusalem, and there will be Jewish weddings, and the city will be thronging with Jews coming in from all over different parts of the world. You read this, a text that is, 2,500 years old sometimes, and you see it happening around you. It's hard not to be intoxicated by that. But the moment of change really happens in the very early days just before statehood. with the first chief rabbi of Palestine, Israel, Rabbi Abraham Isaac Cohen Cook. Cook is the theological anchor for religious Zionism. He actually comes from Chassidut, from the ultra-Orthodox, the more mystical ultra-Orthodox branches. And he sees the state as being the manifestation of God's will. And therefore he writes, and he writes beautifully, poetry, philosophy, a man of great learning, whose books were actually burnt at the time by other ultra-Orthodox thinkers, who was thought to be a heretic in some ways. And he writes there's no better, there's no better way to achieve, spiritual significance, even nirvana maybe you could translate it as, than to take part in the building of the state that isn't a normal state, that is a state that really encompasses God's throne on this earth. And so from his time, right into the beginnings of the state of Israel, you see a religious Zionism or an Orthodox community that's developing that is about supporting the progress and the development of the state of Israel. To this day, if you go to Orthodox Jewish communities, you'll find a higher level of social workers, teachers, people who work in welfare, and those kind of state-building tasks. But the turning point is 1967. Turning point when intoxicating beverage becomes the Kool-Aid. When religious Zionism starts to, in my opinion, as an Orthodox Jew, starts to mutate and become Messianist. In 1967, the Six-Day War, in fact, Rabbi Cook's son, Rabbi Tzvi Yehuda Cook, who at that time is really one of the leaders of religious Zionist thought, they come out and they say this is a miracle. Now, for secular Israelis, many of them say, yes, it was a miraculous victory, Six-Day War. They teach it in West Point and things like that. You're not understanding. When he's saying it's miraculous, it means he saw God's hand come down from heaven and take a role within that victory. It's a very strong statement. It's a strong statement, number one, that you have some kind of level of prophecy or hotline to God, which we don't believe we've had since the prophets. There's a theological challenge in that sense. And it's also a theological challenge because he basically comes in and takes his father's teachings and says, no longer is it about state building. Forget about supporting the state and the government. Now it is about land and land ownership. Now it is about settlement. No matter whether the government wants it or doesn't want it, God does want it. And in some ways that's understandable because in the Six-Day War, suddenly there is this huge victory of lands that you have enormous significance historically and spiritually to the Jewish people. Shiloh, Bet El, Hebron. You're talking about places where the Mishkan, the sanctuary was before the temple. You're talking about the burial plot of the forefathers. You're talking about places that undeniably have huge significance. And Tzvi Yehuda Cook comes in and within a couple of years founds the Gush Emunim, which is the block of the faithful, who are the beginning of the settler movement. It comes out of a theological understanding at the time. I'm on the board of an organization called Oz V'Shalom, which means strength and peace. It's the it's the Orthodox Jewish peace movement in Israel. It developed the same time as the block of the faithful, as a rejection of the block of the faithful, as a counterweight, as a voice against the settler movement and against the perception that in some ways land ownership is our theological pursuit. And so that's why we saw from the late 60s, early 70s, definitely from the early 70s, you see a spate of settlement building at the hands of religious Zionists that is illegal under Israeli law. Something that probably Tzvi Yehuda Cook's father Abraham Isaac, if you remember, would reject to act illegally against the state. And this is highly problematic because it's led us down. That's the beginning of leading us down a garden path to where we find ourselves today, where there's been an infection in my mind of Jewish theology and a misunderstanding of how our relationship to this land should be. And it leads you to that moment in the last elections where Itamar Ben-Gvir had his election slogan, Mikan Baalei Habayit, who are the landlords here? Do we have to be the landlords? This is a misunderstanding of Jewish theology because there is a landlord here and it is God. And there are guardians here and they are us. And our presence here is conditional upon our behavior. And so this kind of twisting of priorities into land ownership, into holding on to holy sites, that in some ways, this is going to, and it became mainstream to say this is the beginning of the redemption. In the synagogues that I go to, 2 synagogues, one Orthodox mainstream and one Orthodox that's a bit, more challenging because it has women doing some of the service. They call it a partnership community. No matter what synagogue you go to, within the Orthodox streams, you will read prayers that have been written since the founding of the State of Israel that say Atchalta Degula, which is an Aramaic phrase. So we're still speaking Aramaic, even though very few others are. Some Christians are, very few others are. That means the beginning of the redemption, saying that the State of Israel is the beginning of the redemptive messianic process. This was not as widespread in its, in its ownership within Jewish society until maybe in the last 20 or 30 years. In the sense that you had senior rabbis in the religious Zionist community, like Rav Amital from the Gush Etzion Yeshiva and others, who would say, I didn't move here because of Atchalta Degula. I didn't move here because this is the beginning of redemption. I don't know if it is or it isn't. That's not why I came here. Today, you'll find that within mainstream Jewish society, having been siphoned through religious Zionism into secular speak as well. And so, Rabbis for Human Rights does not view itself as a counterweight or as another Jewish identity. We see ourselves as what the mainstream should be. We see that we hold authentic Jewish values, that we can bring texts, history, traditions, memories to prove, and it's something that we hold on to. But more than that, because theological conversations are good, but they're not enough, you have to judge people on actions and on behaviors. Theological conversations, it can go one way or the other. And within Judaism, we have a love of the plurality of voices. We always say there's 70 faces to the Torah. 70 faces, 70 different perspectives on it. You can get anything within there. Jewish texts are incredibly diverse. In the Talmud, we have Elisha ben Avuya, who is a rabbi, who was the leading rabbi of his time in the Talmud. And then he becomes a heretic. He becomes a heretic because he sees there's 2 commandments in the Torah. If you respect your parents, and if you shoo away the mother bird before you take the eggs, it says in the Torah, then you will have a longer lifespan. You will have longer days. He sees a boy whose father says to him, climb the tree and bring the eggs. He climbs the tree, he shoos the bird away. He falls from the tree to his death. And Elisha ben Avuya becomes a heretic. He becomes ha'acher, the other, whose voice is still recognized within our text. He's part of the conversation. He's quoted when speaking to Rabbi Meir on his horse on Shabbat, breaking Shabbat on his horse, having a Talmudic conversation. Because that plurality or the multivocality of our text is very important. But within multivocality, you also open the possibility, of having extremism and having liberalism, of having humanists and of having tribalists. All of this you can find within our texts. And you can cherry pick, and we all do. I cherry pick the whole time. And you can say that this makes more sense to me, or I interpret this in a different way, or this I put down on a slower level and this on a higher level. Very hard to come in theologically and just say this is the way it is. In fact, it's not the way our theology works. Throughout every argument in the Mishnah and in the Talmud, all opinions are given, or written opinions. And so in the Mishnah it will say, so-and-so thinks this, so-and-so thinks this, and so-and-so thinks this. The last opinion is the one that's taken, apart from, I think, in 2 places. But generally, the last opinion is the one that's taken. But it's important to give the other opinions as well. It's difficult because when you have that approach of kind of a pluralism of ideas, you do open the door to some pretty problematic ideas as well. And it's impossible to say, this is the law and that's that. And so you can't come into Judaism today and just turn around and say you're wrong. Because it doesn't really exist in that space, Judaism. However, the Judaism within Israel has become incredibly one-dimensional, in the sense that we have a divine right to own this land, and to have sovereignty in this land, and now to have supremacy in this land. When that turns into action, that theological thinking, it turns into a very violent, inhumane way of behaving. There's nothing more difficult than seeing your religion, your own religion, being turned into a tool for evil. For Christians, you might have some living memory of this. You carry maybe a little current memory, but less so than in the past. You have maybe 1,000 years of tradition of your religion being used for evil. But today, within Christianity, it turned a corner at some point, and there's less of that. For me, I see you could argue, it's fine. For me, I see my religion having turned a corner in the other way in the last 50 or 60 years. It's incredibly painful. But it's not something that you can turn away from. Because if you turn your back on that, if you ignore that, and within Israeli Judaism, there's a big school of thought that aims for willful ignorance, that aims to be in a place where you just see your people as wanting to do good and being in a terrible situation and having to carry out the kind of atrocities that we see. There's a willful ignorance of the occupation in Jewish Israeli society. Even if you've served in the territories, something that you scrub from your memory. I meet with hundreds of young Jewish Israeli youth who say, look, we haven't done anything wrong because it's basically Hamas has done everything. The massacres in Gaza, that's Hamas. Our hands are tied. We couldn't make any other decision. And I always challenge, I say, in your life, let's just go back to your lives personally. Do you think you can't make any other, there's no freedom of expression or behavior? You couldn't do things better in your life? You couldn't get a better grade in school in a subject? You couldn't have a better relationship with your family? You couldn't better yourself by, going to the gym more or reading more books? They say, of course. I say, well, why can't that apply to your people? Why can't that apply to your government? You think, and they say, no. It's not within our control, any of this. It's kind of out of our control. And when you put on the table some of the human rights abuses that go hand in hand with the occupation, generally there is a tendency, especially amongst young Israelis, to say, I don't think that you're speaking truth. I don't think that this is possible, what I'm hearing. And so, in fact, many Israelis are less educated than almost everyone in the world about what is actually happening with the occupation. They know very well what's happening within our society. The minute you go over the green line, they have no idea. We are incredibly distraught and worried and concerned about the level of human rights abuses being carried out by the State of Israel in the occupied territories, in the Gaza Strip, and even within the State of Israel. I didn't think we were going to get to this point. I was, 15 years ago, I was the representative for the Jewish Agency in Washington, D.C. they had a whole, it was like around 2010, there was a whole understanding that Jewish American communities were not on the same page with Israel. And we needed to develop a different kind of relationship. And so they hired a whole cadre of people who were progressive and on the left to go and help this relationship change. And we did a lot of really good things, like bringing terms to American Jewish society who had no idea about shared society, about some of the peace initiatives, what can be supported, what the kind of voices you should be hearing. But throughout this period, I would go on the stage, and on every possible stage, I would go on and I say, in my opinion, the occupation is untenable because Israel is such a strong, robust democracy that it will cure the occupation. There's no way a country with these democratic institutions can run an occupation at the same time. I'm a child of the Oslo peace process. That's when I fell in love with this. That's when I, decided to move here. And I thought it was just a matter of time. It's being kicked down, the can's being kicked down the road, but it's going to happen. And I was so wrong, because the occupation infected mainland Israel. Because the whole judicial reform that we saw before October the 7th and has come back on the table of the Knesset now, the judicial reform process that led to one of the biggest democracy movements in the world. We had 1 million people on the streets week in, week out for 8 months here. Powerful movement on the same kind of level as Hungary and Hong Kong. And I give those examples because they too failed on that kind of level, Hungary and Hong Kong. There was a misunderstanding within Israeli society. Israelis never know what to protest about. They know they need to protest. They're not quite sure what it's about. So we had in 2011 the social protest movement that was enormous. That was about the cost of living. Are you insane? You are protesting the cost of living here. It's out of control, the cost of living. But that is not the major issue. People coming and saying that don't take our democracy away from us. No, you've missed what's going on here. The occupation has infected mainland Israel. And that's what happened in the elections of 2022, when you see the most extreme, violent settlers being elected to the highest national office. That's what the judicial reform is about. It's about saying, you know what, we are opting out of liberal democracy, of international standards, of even our own institutional processes, because we have an answer, and it's divine messianism. That's our answer. And if an apocalypse needs to happen, well, sometimes an apocalypse has got to happen on the way. That's maybe the price you've got to pay. Streams within Christianity who aren't sitting around this table who are also willing to pay that price. My children's lives have never been so cheap. The blood of others has never been so cheap that you can believe such things. And so with this government coming into power in 2022, we really saw a consolidation of a toxic theology taking the highest office in the land. And as Rabbis for Human Rights, we knew that this would be a surge in human rights abuses and in extremist settler violence. I've been following and standing against settler violence on the ground since around 2005. My first experience of it was in 2005. I was working in the religious Zionist community, and I ran a dual narrative tour to Hebron. Took a group of Israelis and international students to H2 in Hebron to meet with the settler movement and to meet with Palestinian families. I have to say, some of the best education you can do for progressives is to have them meet with the settler movement. You don't need to say anything after that. It's quite, the people came out, they were just like, wow. But we arrived in a Palestinian house after that, and the settler movement had already said, we can't believe you're meeting with the Palestinians. I said, but we're going to hear their voices about what they're... And we started being stoned when we came into the house. And at that point, I stepped outside to try and stop this madness and was almost attacked myself. The person who helped co-lead the tour was actually attacked afterwards and put in hospital. And there I had my first interaction with Itamar Ben-Gvir. Yeah. And for 20 years I've been fighting Itamar Ben-Gvir on the streets. And for 5 years before this government was elected, I ran a national campaign aimed at the national religious community, saying that extremism is taking hold of your leadership. And you can see how well that social intervention went, right? The most unsuccessful social intervention. And so in 2022, when the government was elected, I at that time had been working for about 10 or 11 years at an organization called the Abraham Initiatives, which is about the equality and status of Palestinian citizens of Israel, 48 Arabs. But I'd been doing a lot of activism on the ground, and this campaign as well that I'd been managing in my spare time. And the minute that those elections, I knew that they were going to get the seats because they were polling at that level. Israeli society was saying no. I protested every single conference of Otzma Yehudit that Itamar Ben-Gvir did around the country. There's only like 10 or 11 people with me. 15 people. Where is everyone? I'm like pleading with people. I things about, do you know the kind of damage this is? I couldn't imagine the damage that it was going to do, but here we are. This is a serious fact in where we are today. And so at that stage, once they were elected, I was like, right, we had an incredible decade of improving the status and government investment for Palestinian citizens of Israel. And by no means equality, but in terms of integration in higher education, integration in the workforce, investment in local authorities, huge packages. Really, it was very satisfying to be working in that field. It was like, wow, the change is happening. But at the same time, within that group of organizations of shared society, forbidden to mention the occupation. Now, I remember just before the elections, I was on a panel with some Palestinian citizens of Israel, and all I spoke about was the occupation. And two of them were very much on board, but one who's probably the most senior leader in that community came to me and said, you are doing us a disservice by speaking about the occupation. You need to put it on one side and just focus on the status of Palestinian citizens of Israel, because that's where we can have impact. And I said to him, but it's connected. One is connected, there's an osmosis between these things. And so that led me to leaving the Abraham Initiatives and joining Rabbis for Human Rights. At the same, in 2005 onwards, I started seeing settler violence from the ground. Started seeing what it looked like. And around those years, it was ragtag. It was wild kids, still a lot of wild kids involved. And it was less strategic. And it was also, they had more fear. They would come at night to graffiti, and they would run in and out of Arab towns because they were so fearful. And we have seen such a change, such an evolution of settler violence, and so quickly, that we have a new series of norms within our society. And in March 2023 was the first daylight pogrom carried out by settlers in the town of Hawara. And I wrote an article in the Haaretz, and I said, this is the problem, this is now the new norm. Because Israeli society, the moment something happens, they say, oh, this is past the watershed, it's terrible. And then it will happen again next week, and then it just becomes the norm. And this is now the norm. And you see, immediately from the government being elected in 2022, it was a dog whistle to the most violent settlers. And then it was a infrastructural change and policy change that enabled and strengthened their actions. When we're on the ground for doing protective presence, and we can speak about this a little bit more, we try to still go down the channels of the rule of law. We call the police and we call the army. The police do not come. The police do not arrest violent settlers. The police do not take a role in it. There's an informal, maybe formal policy not to press charges. In Hawara, there was hundreds of settlers setting fire to their homes with people in them. There were 6 who were detained and they were released the next morning. There hasn't been a charge pressed against them. If we got them into the Israeli court system, there might be a chance. The Israeli court system still has a level of ethical commitment. But they're not getting there. When we call the army shows up and sees their role as protecting the Jewish settlers rather than the Palestinians who are being attacked. The army sees us as a negative force and will immediately issue a closed military zone, even detain us, arrest us. And this happened recently a number of times. We're detained, we're arrested, while we're there in a non-violent action, having been invited by the landowners, the Palestinians, and having called the police and army ourselves. This level of erosion of rule of law you need to pay attention to, because this is a global future. This is the anarchic reality that the rise of this neo-fascism that we're seeing is going to lead to. The Wild West, the West Bank was always the Wild West, but it is out of control at the moment. It's not something that will remain contained within those geographic boundaries. When you erode the rule of law, when you unseat some of the institutions that we've spent so hard building, when you talk about international human rights law, and for me this is especially painful because it comes out of the Holocaust, a lot of this, It comes to that place of we've reached the depths. In Jewish tradition we have, the psalm, we call you from the depths. Because and it's not just when you're in the depths, mimah makim, when you're in the depths, it's not just that there's no one else to call. You get a little bit of clarity in the depths as well. Things crystallize for you in the depths, and you understand we need to create better systems in order to protect people, in order to protect our children's future. And that happened post-Second World War. The International Human Rights, International Court of Justice, the United Nations, all of these, none of which are perfect, but all of which are I'm going to go out on a limb and say a faith-based attempt at writing the course of humanity. And today the attacks that we're seeing on these institutions will leave us ultimately as vulnerable and at risk as the Palestinian communities that we're seeing on the West Bank. And there is a fearful reality in the West Bank today, where communities, especially the most vulnerable communities, we work in Area C. Okay, and I'm guessing most people have an understanding of the regional dynamics. A, B, and C, you understand that? Or we want to open it. In Area C, where there's no Palestinian Authority, and there's the whim of the Israeli military, who as I've just said, are no longer acting to protect Palestinian human rights, even though by international and Israeli law that is their commitment. You see communities who have no one to call. And this is the 21st century, right? This is a moment where we have advanced technologically so far, and morally we're still at sea. We have no understanding. And so Rabbis for Human Rights is the only faith-based voice in Jewish society in Israel that tries to raise firstly the understanding that human rights and Jewish faith go hand in hand, and secondly that the only way that you can preach this is not just through your writings or your theology, but through your actions. You have to be on the ground. We walk this line. It's very difficult because we're very proud of the numbers that we're bringing to the ground, but the reason we're bringing so many numbers to the ground is because there's such abuse of human rights. It's a response. We're at the moment in our planting justice season. We provide protective presence, which is something that you should keep an eye on. Protective presence. The international term for it is Unarmed Civilian Protection, UCP. It's the last resource that you have when everything else has failed. It has been implemented everywhere from Sudan to Sri Lanka to Colombia, because you see when when the armed forces are not doing their job or even perpetrating, what else can you do? And you have to look back in history and you have to say, look, this happens over and over again. Not just, the Western powers refusing to bomb the train tracks to the concentration camps when they knew what was happening. The Dutch soldiers in Srebrenica, the international forces running away in Rwanda, and Kofi Annan saying this, it's not a genocide, it's okay. And in these scenarios, you have such little agency, but you do have the agency over your own presence, physical presence. And the idea of protective presence for us is really to leverage the little privilege and influence that we have. Often when Palestinian communities are being attacked by settlers, the idea is to intimidate them from their lands, to provide continual violence or to attack them. And the settlers are not expecting to see Jewish Israelis there on the side of the Palestinians. It often throws them. They've got more used to it, but it's not something they've expected, and so it changes the dynamic. They haven't expected that we're going to be calling the police and army and bringing them immediately. Even though they won't do much about it, it's not the same as what they've planned. They've planned to come and just, they're in charge. They're the sheriffs. They haven't expected to have Jewish Israelis who are filming them and saving those films for potential Supreme Court cases. They haven't expected to have international eyes on them or sanctions on them from information that's been provided by Jewish Israeli activists. And the international sanctions, much of that information that came to the international governments, and I shouldn't say much because there's being filmed and there's a law in the Knesset at the moment that will put us in jail for doing this at some stage. But those attempts they were not expecting. So during the olive harvest this year, we brought 1,000 volunteers to the ground over 28 days of harvesting. We reached hundreds of dunam, of acres of Palestinian land that the communities hadn't been able to reach because of military restrictions or settler intimidation. And there was hundreds and hundreds of tons of olives that were picked. At the moment, we're planting olive trees every Friday, or sometimes more often, planting olive trees with Palestinian communities who are at risk from settler violence, who have had their olive trees cut down or burnt. The settlers know very well that olive trees have huge cultural and spiritual significance to Palestinian communities. Another town in South Nablus area, and I saw whole groves that have been sawn down. It's an impossible thing to see because these are religious Jews who have done it, and there's a direct commandment in the Torah that you are forbidden to cut down a fruit-bearing tree even at time of war. That's the direct, and we say it in Orthodox Judaism, again, an Aramaic word, doraita, which means from the source. It's like the highest level of commandment. It's a base commandment in the Torah that you're not allowed to cut down a fruit-bearing tree even at time of war. So how can you possibly accept a reality where in 2023, 10,000 Palestinian olive trees, 10,000 were cut down or were burnt or vandalized by Orthodox settlers? It's an affront primarily to the human rights of the Palestinian communities, and secondarily it's an affront to the Jewish religion and faith. For me, for a Jewish person, that's more my sentiment. It's not my livelihood. It's not my sense of security in my home. But it's also important, and I think it needs to be mentioned. And so we go to plant trees. Whenever we go to plant trees, I'd say 50% of the time we are met by armed forces, Israeli armed forces, who are not happy to see us and who have an objective not to allow this to happen. And in fact, this week our director penned a highly emotional and very concrete letter to the Minister of Defense and the head of the army and the head of the Central Command of the army and the head of the Shabak, the Israeli Internal Secret Service, that says, in the past, and when he's only talking like 5 or 10 years ago, this kind of action was seen as a coexistence activity that, there was sympathy towards it. If you look 6 years ago, 7 years ago, the Israeli army had a policy that said until the last olive, to try and enable Palestinian farmers to harvest the olives of their land. That policy is so far from where we are today. Our director wrote this as a survivor of October the 7th, a direct survivor. We have a number of direct survivors who are with us on the ground, who are, they are our moral compass. They are anchor for humanity. When we see people whose families were taken from them, but still holding on to the humanity of seeing the other and understanding the human rights abuses against Palestinians are intolerable. It's a difficult time because, we're surrounded by security threats. We don't know which way to look. I live in a small town called Tzor Adasa, which is about half an hour, 40 minutes from Jerusalem, just on the Israeli side of the Green Line, before Bethlehem area. We don't know which way to look sometimes because the majority of the Houthi missiles are shot above us, and so there's parts of Houthi missiles that fall in our town. My kids are outside and there's Houthi missile falling. It's not a good situation. You don't know which way to look. There's attacks on the road. There's violent settlers around in the Palestinian villages. Yesterday, we celebrated, with some bitterness, but we celebrated the return of Elia Cohen, who is a hostage from our town, a neighbor of ours. His mother's a wonderful person, a strong woman, after 500 days of captivity. And we're surrounded by psychopaths. Every which way you look here, you're surrounded by psychopathic behavior. At the same time as these hostages being released, you had the Hamas ceremonies, which are just psychopathic, okay? And to bring hostages who are to see it. At the same time, the Israeli authorities put down 650 Palestinian prisoners on buses and then change their minds and send them back to their cells. Yeah. It's you don't see the worth of the individual human life. The minute that you lose the understanding of the inherent sanctity of every human life, it enables you to do the worst atrocities you can imagine. And this is what we're seeing around us being lost. And it's a slow motion train wreck with a cliff at the end of it. I was left bewildered when and I'm actually flying to Germany tomorrow. When I was in Germany in the outbreak of the Ukraine war, and the Germans were like, how can this happen on our doorstep? How can this happen in Europe almost? What do you mean, how can this happen? This is human nature. This is what happens. What do you think has happened? You think we've changed our DNA and our genetics, or we've made some kind of solution to the moral conundrum of being inherently good and inherently evil at the same time? Like, how do we deal with this? And so this is, to say this is an uphill challenge is, I think, incorrect. I don't think we should be aiming and saying we're going to provide solutions or solve what's happening, but it's about trying to do the right thing in moments of crisis. And we're very much within a moment of crisis at the moment, a protracted level of crisis. And when we see, when October the 7th happened, I immediately, and I lost friends on October the 7th, and a lot of things changed on October the 7th. But I realized immediately, like the Israeli administration, who only sees military solutions in a conflict or an occupation, one of the two, they're both going on, that doesn't have military solutions, is about to carry out massacres and war crimes. And that's what played out. Because there wasn't an Israeli administration saying, let's think about this in a different way, after rejecting even the idea of a peace process for 20 years. As I say to young Israelis, when they say, young Israelis find what we have to say almost offensive. And they always challenge. And they say, well, what's your solution? And the reason they ask, what's your solution, is because they are so well versed in why there isn't a solution, in why your solution is naive or traitorous or worse. You're on the other side, maybe. because they have had the here we go. This is romantic.
We can continue.
Yes. And so then when they ask, what's your solution? Rabbis for Human Rights doesn't hold one solution. We hold a human rights-based approach. And so we do a lot of interfaith work because we do see the shared values between the different faiths. But our faith-based interfaith work is focused on human rights and ultimately focused on activism. And I think this is our religious commitment at this time. And thank you very much.